He was the public address announcer for the Houston Rockets and now is the full-time play-by-play radio announcer for the Houston Rockets. We welcome Matt Thomas onto Hoopsology. How's it going, Matt?
Justin, it's a pleasure to be on. How are you this evening?
Doing really well, and thanks for coming on to the show. When I first reached out to you, you were the public address announcer, and then all of a sudden you became the full-time play-by-play announcer, the voice of the Rockets on the radio side of things. How has that been for you in terms of adjusting to that full-time role?
Well, it's a dream come true. When I was a kid, I wanted to shoot basketball. I wasn't a good athlete, so I had to talk about basketball. So I was able to, at the age of 22, be the PA announcer for the Rockets during their first two championships. And then I stepped away to do some play-by-play for my alma mater, the University of Houston, moved to Salt Lake and to Minneapolis for a handful of years, and then came back in 2010, and then had a chance to reconnect with the Rockets, which was now 6 years ago, to do the PA for the home games and the radio play-by-play for the road games. We had a broadcaster here by the name of Bill Worrell, who had been a broadcaster for the Rockets on television for 40-plus years. He'd cut his schedule back to non-traveling. So he officially hung it up last year. And Craig Ackerman, who is the normal television announcer on the road, got the home assignments as well. And I slipped into the home spot. So everything came full circle, and I have been very happy and pleased that I get to call all 82 games. I'd like to say 82-plus playoffs, but first things first, we got to get this rebuild underway.
For sure. And I want to talk to you about the differences between, radio play-by-play and being the public address announcer. What was the transition like, and what kind of adjustments did you have to make, in getting onto like being, calling each play on kind of the radio side of things? Because, even with TV, it's very visual. You can actually see what's happening. But radio, you're painting the picture in terms of the listener's mind. So what adjustments did you have to make?
Yeah, it's not really adjustments. It's just the change of assignment.
Gotcha.
When I was doing the PA, I would never do the play-by-play because that's what PA announcers don't do and ever do. So you basically have an on and off switch. And when the basket is scored or a foul is committed or a timeout is called or a traveling or double dribble, you say it and then you move on. If you have to introduce the dancers or a contest. But that's one job that never requires you to do the exact play-by-play of everything happening on the court. Radio play-by-play, as you mentioned, is the theater of the mind, and you're responsible for telling the audience that's listening to every single thing that happens. So it's not an adjustment. It's just you have a new responsibility, so you have to take the responsibility that's given to you, and you go with it. And that's why, for me, it's a lot more work. But as a broadcaster with a radio show and a play-by-play guy through and through, it was the adjustment I was ready to make.
Can you kind of go over your journey in terms of when you first became the public address announcer for the Rockets, what that experience was like, and maybe just draw a parallel, it's not parallel, but like the differences between when you first, became, part of the Rockets organization to now, just to the evolution of just the game of basketball in general, professionally.
Yeah. 1993, I was just 21 years old, and the Rockets were looking to hire a new PA announcer at the Summit at the time where the Rockets played. And they had an audition, and I was a young broadcaster working for a radio station in Houston. And my bosses and my friends said, "Hey, go try out for it. What do you have to lose?" And I had done PA when I was in high school. And I always knew that would be something I'd like to do in my life at some point, along with the radio play-by-play or television or whatever it is. And so I applied, and I got all the way down to the final two. But I didn't get the job originally. They gave it to somebody else who was older than I was and had perhaps more speaking experience, because I was really just young in my radio career, didn't have a lot of talk show experience, would add a few things here and there. I was more of a sidekick than a host. Well, they hired this guy, and part of being an NBA PA announcer is knowing the NBA, the vernacular, the 2 minutes, the fouls, how to say it, when to say it, and he just never could catch on. So probably in January of 1994, they let him go, and they called me back and said, "Would you like to take over?" And I said, "Well, of course I would. Here I am, still 21 years old at the time, and I'm the PA announcer at the Summit with the best seat in the house. I mean, I'm center court on the floor. I mean, there's nobody has a better seat than I do." So we finished that half season up, and oh, by the way, they won their first championship in 1994, and I was on national TV, and I made an appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman as a guest to introduce a couple of his buddies at the time named Mujibur and Sarajul. These were a couple of Dave Letterman's neighbors who were traveling around the country, and they came to Houston. So I got a lot of notoriety of that. Did the full season in 1994, 1995. They won their second championship. Did 95, 96. Was fortunate enough to get a call from the NBA to do the World Championships in London, where I did the PA for every single game in
Wow.
London while I was there. I was only supposed to do the Rockets games because at the time, the Rockets were the United States representative to these FIBA championships. They said, hey, do you mind sticking around doing every single game? So I would do U.S. versus Australia, and then the next game I'd have China versus Argentina. So there were a lot of names that I had to go through, and it was certainly a great experience. I was able to bring my girlfriend with me at the time, who's now my wife of over 20 years, and so that was a great experience. And then I did the Olympics in 1996 because of what my experiences were like in London. So Dream Team 2 at the Georgia Dome in Atlanta, I was one of the 4 PA announcers that did every game. So there was obviously many more countries. So we split up between the 4 of us, and I did 2 of the Dream Team games, which I thought was very cool. Here I am again, just 22 years old. So I was a kid in the candy store. Did the 95, 96 season, and then the University of Houston, my alma mater, which I was still a student at the time because as my radio career was going and my Rockets career was going, I had forgotten to do one thing, graduate from college. So I'm working 40 hours a week, doing the Rocket stuff, doing the play-by-play for the University of Houston, and I'm going to school at the same time. So here I am calling a football game, say at LSU, and there are 3 or 4 guys in my class that I'm calling the play-by-play for. So that was a very interesting run. So I did that for a couple of years. I did Rice for several years. I went to the University of Utah for a couple of years. And then all of a sudden, full circle, after I moved to Salt Lake City and then on to Minneapolis, as I said, in 2010, I decided to bring my family back to Houston, where I grew up and where their grandparents were and whatnot, and kind of hung around, did some play-by-play, and got back with the University of Houston, and was happy to do the University of Houston games on the radio until the Rockets called me and said, "Hey, we'd like for you to be our PA announcer again." And I said, "Well, thanks, but no thanks, because play-by-play is much more of a prestigious thing for me than just doing the PA." And they said, "What if we gave you the road games on the Rockets and the PA at home?" I said, "Done." And I'd done it the last 5 years. And it was a really interesting mix because I don't think anybody in NBA history, I mean, there may be some PA guys that are play-by-play guys, but not doing it at the exact same time.
Sure.
Doing PA and road radio play-by-play was kind of an interesting dynamic and combination. So I'd have been happy doing it for 3 or 4 more years. But when Bill Worrell decided he wanted to retire, that's when the transition took place. And that's why I'm now fortunately able to do all the games on the radio now.
I want to ask you, do you have any kind of interesting stories in terms of, players coming up to you and in terms of how they want their names to be pronounced? Did they have any weird requests in terms of how they wanted to be introduced, or just maybe even like announcing the opposing team, kind of what that dynamic is like? Just try not to give them energy. They're the opposing team. You want them to lose. So,
well, I'll tell you this. I'll give you one great story.
Sure.
It's the only time I think I've gone viral since my second tour with the Rockets. Remember the Rockets and the Warriors played for the Western Conference Championship? What was it, 2017, I think?
I believe so.
18, whatever that was. Sure. These years get lost in transition.
Yeah.
It was the year that Chris Paul hurt his hamstring.
Mm-hmm.
Rockets are up 3-2 at Golden State. They have 2 games left at the Toyota Center to win the Western Conference Championship. Well, Game 7 comes into play, and TNT brings Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, Ernie Johnson. They do their studio show from the arena as they would normally do during the Western Conference Finals. They decide to carry my starting lineups. And anybody that had been to Toyota Center before knows that I am very much deadpanned, indifferent, almost rude about the starting lineups for the other team. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. I'll say, at the time, at guard from Arizona State, number 13, James Harden, and get real excited. Or I'll say CP3, bring that team. Well, if it's the other team, I'll say, this is what I would go like. I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Toyota Center for tonight's game between the Golden State Warriors and your Houston Rockets. Now, let's meet tonight's starters. First, for the Golden State Warriors. And I did that on national television. And I rudely introduced Draymond Green and Klay Thompson and Steph Curry. And I rudely introduced Steve Kerr, head coach. And it went bonkers in the NBA world. you can still go to YouTube and have people watching me do the lineups going, this guy is savage. He's so rude. 99% of America thought it was the greatest announcement ever. 1%, Oakland, San Francisco
Right.
needed it. That was for me the moment of, wow, that's interesting that my lineups, which I do for every team, I treated Golden State the same way I would treat Memphis, I would treat Cleveland, I would treat Brooklyn, Orlando, whomever. That was the moment because it was on national television. People saw how anti I was for the visiting team.
Matt, I want to talk to you just about the vibe of the Rockets right now. We talked off air just about how the team is going through a rebuilding stage right now. What is the vibe of the fans, not only through this rebuilding process, but also things from a sporting standpoint, getting back to normal in terms of like full capacity crowds
Yeah.
compared to the past 2 seasons? What has that dynamic been like for the fans specifically in Houston?
Well, obviously, it's very early in the game, but fans being in the arena obviously makes a difference not only in Houston but in every other city. The reality is, this was a terrible basketball team last year. It had the number 2 pick. It had just as good a chance of being 1, 2, 3, or 4 than anybody else did in that bottom rung because of the record. It had been hit by COVID. It had been hit by injury. It had been hit by Russell Westbrook being traded, James Harden being traded, PJ Tucker being traded, Christian Wood missing a lot of time.
Yeah.
So, needless to say, the organization just for the first time, think about this, I don't know, 20 years, hit rock bottom. I mean, even when the Rockets weren't making the playoffs on a regular basis or were just getting in, they had never gone 20-62. They had never gone 30-52. They were, if they weren't making the playoffs, they were in that 41, 42, 43 win category. So this was such foreign territory for the Rockets and their fans, probably going back to the early 80s when the Rockets got Ralph Sampson with the first pick one year, and then the next year they got Hakeem Olajuwon. So needless to say, at this point, expectations are minimal because of all the young players. We're talking about 4 first-round picks. We're talking about 2 of them under the age of 20. We're talking about a really young basketball team that's been kind of built by scratch. There are a couple of veteran players still around. DJ Augustine, Eric Gordon, Daniel Tice coming in that sign-and trade with Chicago. But generally speaking, it's a bunch of babies, and I mean that with all due respect.
Sure. What's your expectations for Jalen Green? Just saw a little bit of him. He seems like he has tons of potential. I know talking to some other Rockets fans and just journalists, they see a massive upside with his potential. What do you think of him so far?
Well, again, it's 2 games in the preseason, so I don't want to read too much into it. Did not shoot well in the first game against the Washington Wizards. Shot a lot better the other night against Miami. He's going to go through rookie growing pains, but obviously the explosion, obviously a guy that can probably hit from any spot on the floor. He can attack the lane. Question's going to be defensive intensity at the NBA level. I think anybody that was doing anything sort of scouting report would say that was probably the biggest thing that was potentially holding him back. Maybe he wasn't the first pick for that, but I don't buy into that. He looks the part. I think him and Kevin Porter Jr. are going to be a very interesting, fun backcourt. The reality is, it's just going to take some time for those guys to grow up. They're going to go through a lot of growing pains. And I think, Justin, frankly, the biggest thing for me is they're going to lose some games.
Yeah.
They might lose a lot of games. Can they withstand the, well, this is not my fault or it's your fault kind of thing? And that's what a lot of young basketball teams have to go through.